It's 7:03. Welcome all, and tonight we are very, very fortunate to have two anglers who fish the Upper Delaware River a great deal and love this river, and the name of their talk is called Alleviating Thermal Stress on the Upper Delaware River, and it's presented by Dr. Peter Colosar and also Jim Serio. And I would like to just read two brief introductions, and then I will give the floor over to both Dr. Colosar and also to Jim. Peter Colosar. Peter Colosar is a professor emeritus at Columbia University, where he held appointments in both the business and engineering schools, and is currently a member of Columbia's Water Center. His path-breaking research on the deployment of police and firefighting forces won him the 1975 Lanchester Prize of the Operations Research Society of America and the 1976 NATO Systems Science Award. This work has been implemented in cities around the United States, including in New York during the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers. His research is the basis for modern visual field screening for glaucoma, and more recently dealt with optimizing the search for IEDs in Afghanistan. Much of Peter's mathematical work is focused on the statistics of congested in-service systems and on optimal staffing of them. Professor Colosar is the author of some 50 technical papers, the recipient of numerous honors, and is a fellow of several scientific societies. Over more than 2 decades, Peter Colosar has also worked to increase the effectiveness of quality and productivity management in the United States industry, and has twice been an examiner for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. He has been a frequent consultant to both industry and governments worldwide. His joint research with Jim Serio and others provided the foundation for the 2007 implementation of the Delaware's innovative Flexible Flow Management Program, also known as FFMP. In recognition, both Jim and Peter received the Conservationist of the Year Award of the Theodore Gordon Fly Fishers and were the Lord High Admirals of the Delaware Sojourn in 2011. Peter Colosar was a founder and chairman of the board of the Montana Fly Company and was president of the Montgomery Lake Association. He is a dedicated guitarist and avid fly fisherman. While an undergraduate, he captained the Columbia University water polo team and was elected 3 times to the A11 ECAC team. James Serio, the founder of the Delaware River Foundation, is a retired fly fishing guide, a resident of Starlight, Pennsylvania, and a real estate broker in Hancock, New York. As a longtime river advocate, he has spent countless hours learning and developing an expertise in the 2 key mathematical Delaware River models: OASIS, which simulates river flows under both actual and hypothetical water release rules, and also the USGS DSS habitat model, which converts river flows to estimates of aquatic habitat. Jim's research with these models contributed to the fishery enhancing recommendations of the influential 2010 joint New York-Pennsylvania Fisheries White Paper. He is dedicated to the development of a best science available solution to the flows issue of the Upper Delaware River Basin, and was a central member of the team that developed the prototype for the Delaware's current FFMP release rules. Living on the Delaware River has given him an insightful and unique perspective as to the environmental needs of this widely diverse system. Jim has a bachelor's degree in chemistry and biology from St. Lawrence University and did graduate work in aquatic ecology at SUNY ESF. Jim served on the steering committee for the Delaware River Basin Commission to develop and update the existing basin plan for the Delaware River Basin. Jim also served as the town of Hancock representative on the Upper Delaware Council and represented the village of Hancock for many years on the Upper Delaware Scenic Byway. So as chair, I want to thank both Dr. Colosar and Jim Serio for attending tonight, and I look forward to their presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, listen, Tony, just stop this formality. Just call us both Admiral.
Okay. We'll do Admiral 1 and 2.
Admiral. Everyone look at his website. It's the Admiral's website. Okay. Listen, And Jim should come up closer here if I need a little more protection.
That's okay.
At some point in this talk, they need some protection. It's nice to start with this picture of the fish because, as Jim and I have said on a number of occasions when we made presentations, our work, the client is the fish. But our client is not the fisherman. We're really trying to make conditions better for the fish. And if that makes it better for the fishermen, so be it. But you know, sometimes conditions that the fishermen like may not be the same things that are in the benefit of the fish. So we're here today to persuade the Upper Delaware Council, through you folks who are its Water Use and Resource Management Committee, to support an initiative that we've been working on for at least the last year and a half of active research to try to get some mitigation for the severe thermal stresses that all fishermen know occur frequently in the summer on the Upper Delaware. This initiative is supported by a large number of fishing-oriented conservation organizations who, and the politics of this are heating up right now. There's a decision will have to be made by the parties to the Supreme Court decree who actually manage the river and whose unanimous approval is needed for any change of the operating rules by June 1st. An important meeting is going to be happening in a couple of weeks in Trenton. There's a committee of the DRBC that will be again presenting more of our arguments to. And so a timely input from the Upper Delaware Council would really, I believe, be helpful. I would remind you that you folks did do similar action a few years back when you supported the Joint Fisheries White Paper, which was very important. It's proven to be very influential, and it's still influential to this day. So what we're going to do here this evening is present our ideas, which are a foundation for how you could achieve thermal relief. We are not going to present all the details of exactly how a program should be architected, partially because the decree parties have asked us not to. They've asked us that we should suggest a framework, and they would like to have the last word in the details. So we're actually proposing that they go along with our framework and that we work collaborative to work out the details. And I want to make the point at the outset here that this relief program that we're talking about is an add-on to the programs that already exist, entirely consistent with the current FFMP OST rules which govern the river. And as you'll see, they do not interfere with the interests of any of the river stakeholders in our judgment. So here's a summary of the points that I want to make this evening. In fact, we could just stop with this slide. If this is persuasive, let's all go out for a beer or a coffee or something. Okay, it says fact. From our research, everyone knows there are these episodes of thermal stress. We've gone and we looked at the data from the USGS gauges on the river. Over the last decade, in the upper main stem, it's experienced an average of 12 days of severe thermal stress to the trout per summer. And the worst summer, 23 severe stress days. That's over the last decade. And our definition, you'll see, focuses on Lordville, on the upper river, and summer months. So that's the problem. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we mean by thermal stress in a moment.
Peter, do you know what year that 23 severe thermal stress days occurred in?
I'll have to look. I don't know off the top of my head, but it'll be on one of the charts, I believe. And there are 2 years with pretty big numbers like that. So second part of our research, that's like chunks of research. That was step number one. How big is the problem? The second was, what could you do to alleviate the problem? And here's one theory, is cold water is released from the dams. If you release more cold water, that cold water will flow down the river and it will cool the water down the river. So the question is, how much do you need to add? We've done some statistical research that shows that 118, CFS is cubic feet per second. It's a standard measure for a discharge from the dams. An additional pulse of this for a day, cold water from Cannonsville, will knock down the summertime water temperature at Lordville by 1 degree Fahrenheit. And we'll show you how we arrive at that. That's a key number. So The first little bullet point tells you the magnitude of the problem. The second tells you something about what you have to do to alleviate the problem. But of course, some more details are necessary. Putting those two together, our estimate is that stress mitigation in an average summer would take about 3,400 CFS days of water. Here's what that means. That means that for a full day, 24 hours, you would release 3,400 CFS for a day. That's the magnitude of water. So CFS is a rate, multiplied by days, and you get the magnitude of the water. So that's the amount of water you'd have to release from the dams to mitigate this stress in an average summer. In the worst summer, it takes about twice that amount, 6,500 CFS days. Question is there that amount of water available to do the job? And we're going to demonstrate that we believe there definitely is, that water is available and it could be released with no negative impact on other Delaware stakeholders, including most particularly New York City, because as you're all aware, New York City owns the dams. New York City basically operates the dams subject to rules of the decree parties. But that key constituency here, above all others in New York City, we convinced them that we could do this without imperiling their water supply. We're well down the road, we think. Now, the next part is this. Our judgment is, experience is, that it's not good to wait until one of these stress events occurs, until the water heats up. It's like you're too late. The water heats up, the rocks heat up, and you've done some damage and you can't do much mitigation. So one question is, can you forecast these events? And they really can be forecasted. Just human beings are doing a good job. Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Representative Mark Harnell has done a good job over the last couple of summers. And we've developed a statistical method to augment that. So the point is that these events can be forecasted at least a day in advance, sometimes perhaps more than a day in advance, and that's the key to success. And if you know it's coming and you know how bad it's going to be, then you do the arithmetic for how much water you have to release, and you do the timing so the water gets there in time. Now, this is not like a new idea. We're not inventing some zany thing here. These techniques are used in other rivers out west, on the Madison River, and used here on a tributary of the Delaware on the Lackawaxen. PPL has a program that's been in operation for the last 2 years, operating very effectively, and I can testify to our many evenings misspent on the Lackawaxen. They are really controlling those temperatures quite well, and they're doing it with constraints that are similar to the constraints we face on the Delaware. So, bottom line is our recommendation. Some of our findings here are, let's say, theoretical from this history and statistics. So we're recommending an experimental thermal relief program based on these ideas that be included in the June 2013 revision of the release rules, the FFMP OST release rules. The details of how to do that, Jim and I, we could design it, but we're stepping back a little bit and saying, let's work out the details, and there are some actual bureaucratic managerial details that need to be worked out through collaboration between our Conservation Coalition, New York City DEP, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, and New York State Fisheries folks who have various kinds of expertise to bring to the table. And so we're hoping that you folks and the Upper Delaware Council are going to support this recommendation. So I'm not kidding, we can stop here if this is persuasive enough. But give a professor the screen, you can stop me. I'm going to blow by some of this stuff. It just says, this has been happening. I'm going to show you some slides. It's been happening. People have been trying to do something about it, and they haven't been very effective, basically because they're kind of making up the rules as they go along, and the bureaucratic structure that you need to make decisions quickly isn't in place. So we're proposing then formality of the rules and formality of that decision structure. And we undertook this 1.5 year long research rule to come up with the data that I'm going to show you. For those who are not entirely familiar with the river, we're talking about the section of river from Hancock to Lordville. And this map comes from the famous Joint Fisheries White Paper that that you folks supported. And the blue are sections that they believe are really great trout waters, and the green here is a sort of marginally good trout water that would be better if we could achieve this kind of thermal stress relief. So our thrust is to try to make that part of the river better for the trout, to make it bluer, if you will. There'll probably be some discussion later about what happens below Lordville to Hankins, Hankins to Callicoon. These are sections of the river that I particularly love. I fish those sections quite a bit. They're great fishing in the early part of the summer, but in the later summer by mid-June, so they typically warm up, and it would be dangerous to fish for trout there. We are.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
I'm back on that slide. Now, wouldn't we conclude that if you were able to upgrade that section between Hancock and Moorville, isn't that going to improve on itself? A lot of that area between Moorville and Hankins?
To some extent, yes. But the main thrust is this, is that if you can control temperatures at Lordville, at this bottom end, that section from Hankins to Lordville will definitely be protected. You certainly get some mitigation further downriver. But as I'll show you in one of my slides, you get a decreasing effect as the water warms and more tributaries come in with warm water. So the effect gets smaller and smaller as you come downriver. Essentially, by the time you get near to Callicoon, the river's coming into thermal equilibrium with the environment. And there's not a lot that you can do for the river below there unless you would have truly massive releases of cold water. By the way, I welcome questions as we go. So our thrust is the trout, but we're very, very aware that we need 5 votes for any proposal we've ever made. And so we have to be aware of the other interests of the river. Water supply of 15 million Americans. The city of New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, and southern New Jersey are quite dependent on Delaware water. Flood risk to the valley residents. Other recreation uses in our 2 national park segments, and other wildlife needs, the shad, the bass, the endangered dwarf wedge mussels, the oysters, Delaware Bay. All of these are impacted by water policy. And so we're quite alert to, and much of our background research has focused on a lot of these other issues to try to make sure that we do no harm. At the same time, we do good for the trout, do no harm to the other constituents. And I don't want to focus on this. In some technical presentations we make, this chart is really important. It's just that as basically engineers, the 2 of us are really taking an engineering approach. We look at this as an engineering problem. You've got these big pots of water in the 3 reservoirs. They flow down the river. As they flow, the water warms and mixes. We're concerned with Lordville. The Montague gauge plays an important role because of the Supreme Court decree. New York City is sucking out sometimes very large quantities of water from the reservoir. So the dynamics of all of that dictate what's possible and what's not possible. Okay. All right. So, and again, I'll just say here, water availability is really important. No one should be deluded to think that there's plenty of water to go around the Delaware. It's just not true. The Delaware is not like river systems out west. Our dams only hold roughly 1 year's supply of water. So if you get in trouble with 1 year, you gotta hope somehow you get out of it the next year. And what happened in the 1960s, we were 4 successive years of really serious drought. And that's what causes New York City to be cautious. They are, in some ways, appropriately cautious. And the timing of when water comes into the reservoirs and when the water is needed is also out of sync. Then you've got the flood people who want there to be voids in the reservoirs. Any drop of water that's not in the reservoirs, a drop of water that's neither available to New York City nor available to us in the river. So it all adds up to the fact that it's enough to get by, but you gotta be careful. About severe thermal stress, and fishing folks in the room will be alert to this. It's very well understood by the scientific fishing community and by fishermen around the river that when the water gets above 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the trout are in trouble. When it gets above 75, it's really, really lethal. Our Conservation Coalition, and a lot of discussion about this, has adopted a somewhat conservative definition of what we call severe thermal stress. We are trying to protect the fish against 75 degrees Fahrenheit as the maximum daily water temperature, which is 23.9 degrees centigrade. At that kind of temperature, trout die or they have to abandon their stations in the river and migrate at additional stress themselves. So that is our focus. And I just want to say, again, we didn't pick this out of the air. There's a good body of precedent for using that measure, that constraint, even locally on the Delaware. These are just documents relating to the Delaware that cite this 75 degrees as an important metric of thermal stress for trout. I briefly want to make a point, is that over the years, partially, and Jim and I are proud of the work that we've done, input to the design of the FFMP, but others as well, that conditions on the river have gotten better. This is a chart for Cannonsville from 1966 to 2012. Each one of these graphs is a graph of the basic conservation releases of the river. This is what the conservation releases were in 1966, which is really totally lethal for trout. And as we moved on, this is the first implementation of the FFMP, and then why the white paper was so important. We're very, very close to the white paper in the last revision of the FFMP OST. So we're close to situations that a few years back we thought we would never be able to persuade New York City or the Crete parties to get to. So things have been getting better, and the Calhoun daily flows over the years from 76 to 2012. Basically a modest improvement. The spikes, though, have to be discounted because those are flood events. But basically, we're doing pretty well. But despite that, water temperatures in the river spike. And this is the data for Lordville. So what I'm showing you here is the last summer we just went through, June 1st to August 31st. And this graph is the maximum daily water temperature at Lordville. And this is the protection line. Anytime you go above the red dotted line, you're in trouble. So the moral of the story here is there were 14 such stress days in 2012. There probably would have been 15, except that Pennsylvania Fish and Boat and New York State DEC intervened, and they did get exactly the kind of pulse release that we're calling for. However, they called for those releases 4 other times during the summer, and they were either denied or ignored. We really couldn't even tell what happened. The messages got lost in the bureaucracy. So the game is this. Can we anticipate when these will happen, and can we tailor releases to knock the blue spikes down to be below the red bar? That's what the whole thing's about. Just to show you, this is now the same kind of chart, but all summers, 2007 to 2012. So this happens repeatedly, summer after summer after summer, and some summers are worse. As Don asked, one of those summers has got 27 days, and it looks to me like it might be 2008. Okay, and we know that this idea will work because it has been tried. This is an example from 2011 when Pennsylvania Fish and Boat and New York State DEC called for a pulse release. It was made, and here's what happened. These are river temperatures going up, and then the pulse release is made, and the river temperature gets knocked down. That's what motivated us to do this research. This chart was displayed at a Fishermen's Conservation Conference. It was held 2 years ago. And it was at that point that Jim and I volunteered to undertake this research project to see if we could formalize this a bit. Well, you can, because it's physics. It's water, and it's heat, and sunshine, and so the mathematics that we did worked out really nicely because we're using a lot of theory. We're not going to use these complicated equations, but that theory guides us. Here's how the water warms. It comes out of the Cannonsville Dam. This is the Stilesville gauge on the river, USGS gauge, which is just downstream of the dam. It's coming out here at about 47 degrees. and it heats up, the Hale Eddy to Hancock. At Hancock, the East Branch comes in. East Branch water is typically warmer. Brings in water from the Beaverkill, which is warmer. By the time it gets to Lordville, it warms up to 66.8 on average. And by the time it gets to Callicoon, it's warmed up to 70.4. And you see that curve is going up. It's going toward equilibrium temperature with the atmosphere and the ground. So by the time you get to Port Jervis, it's going to be at equilibrium.
Peter, I got a question. And
Sure.
through that graph, what is the release that we're talking about, 350?
Now, this is the average 2007 to 2011, and the answer to your question is a little bit complicated because the release rules changed over that time period.
Right.
In 2007, the base release rule from Kansville was 300.
Okay.
It moved from 300, 350, and now it's at 500. So that's an average over that time period.
Okay.
Peter, are the temperatures at Lordville based on the USGS temperature gauge that's located there?
That's right, yeah.
You might want to consider looking at the new Park Service gauge there that's located off one of the bridge piers in about 6 feet of water, and just looking at a comparison of how the temperature readings you're getting there are to the USGS gauge, which is located on the Pennsylvania side of the river in about 2 feet of water, whereas the other gauge is in about 6 feet of water, and I think maybe more representative of the flows at that location. I think it'd be worth looking at those two for comparison.
Sure. And I know other gauges that you guys have in the river. And Jim's got some of your data already, so we're prepared to do that. Okay, great. Jim's sitting in the back of the room there, at least he's taking notes. Come up here. Help me. Okay, so just to give you a sense that this is a pretty complicated, dynamic situation. Again, I'm showing you here the summer, June to August. And the lowest line here, the blue line, is the water as it comes out of Stylesville. It comes out of Kansville at Stylesville. And you see it's coming out cold. And luckily, in 2012, we never ran out of really cold water. So it warms up slightly, but basically you have that cold water coming out. We have to be careful. In some summers, if you release too much water from the reservoir, you run out of cold water and you start discharging warm water. As you go downriver to Hale Eddy, the water warms up. And notice it becomes more spiky, because what's happening is you're getting inflows from the tributaries, which are warmer and in different magnitudes day by day. Hancock gauge, warmer and still more spiky. Lordville gauge, warmer and more spiky. And Callicoon gauge, warmer and more spiky. So we have to understand this dynamic. You got a lot of variability in the system. The water is basically warming, as I indicated in this chart, on average, but the averages aren't the whole story. A lot of variability here. And in fact, the water warms through the summer. As we'll see, July is the most critical time period on the river. By the time, luckily, in most summers, by the time you get to August, things start to cool down. So we have a lot of focus on July. That's the reservoir discharge. Okay. Now, what we're concerned with, again, fishermen will be aware of this, the water warms up and cools down each day in an almost sine wave fashion here. So this is, again, Lordville. Now, this is 15 minutes by 15 minutes. And what we're concerned with, more than anything else, is the peak. So the thrust of this program is looking at the daily maximums and keep that daily maximum below 75 is the game plan. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. I already told you the story before. There were 5 of these events. Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission called 4 out of 5 of them, and 3 out of the 4, their request was denied. The one that was made was effective, and one of the ones that wasn't made led to a kind of disaster of a long 8-day period of really high temperatures in August. And all the time, this is what frustrates us, there was water in a reservoir that could have been used to do the job. And to show you that, this is a chart from the DRBC itself. This is their typical chart, and a lot of you have seen these charts. This is showing the actual water in the reservoir over time. This is, again, over the summer of 2012, in comparison to the warning limits. And when you get below these limits, you're in some level of trouble. So notice that this purple line, actual water, is way above any warning limit. And it is, in fact, most of the time, very, very close to the long-run median. So they were in a healthy situation, and we got into a period here in the beginning of August when there was a forecast for really high temperatures to come. Petition was made to release water. In our judgment, the water was there, and the petition wasn't honored. So we are pushing toward correcting that situation. Okay, everyone agrees, huh? Okay. All right, here we go. So we then need to measure how bad the problem is, and we looked at a number of things. How many days does this kind of event occur on? When they occur, how long are they? When they occur, how high do these temperatures get? We want to get a sense of the magnitude of the problem and really how much cooling you have to do. It's kind of like we're going to run like an air conditioner. And we need to know how many cooling days we're going to need, because the cooling days come from the water, and that's how we calculate the water. So we did a lot of detailed analysis year by year for the records. By the way, the gauges aren't always operating, so there are holes in the record. And we looked in detail by year, by month, by days, and here's the conclusion we came to. As I said at the beginning, on average 12 such days in the summer. One summer, 1992, had none, and Don, to answer your question, the worst summer was 1995, 23 days. Recent summers that we might remember, 2010 was pretty damn bad, 18. 2011, by contrast, had only 3, and 2012 had 14. Stress days cluster in July. July is the big problem. 24% of July days at Lordville over these 10 years of data we looked at were in stress, compared to the summer-wide average of 13%. There was some concern in our community about whether something should be done in May and September. The occurrence of stress is so infrequent there that we decided not to include it in our program. How bad does it get when it gets bad? Mercifully, we're really lucky, it doesn't get very, very bad. Like 76.4, it's like a little bit above, which means you only need a modest shot of water to bump it back down again. However, there are occasions when it does really get bad, that 81.3, if you've got that, that's going to take a bigger bolt of water to cure. We calculate degree days the same way you do for heating and for cooling, because it's a measure that we give, say, New York City, say, to estimate how much water you need the water to alleviate those degree days. So these statistics are important to them, and are concerned that these events, when they occur, are about 3 days in duration on average. But the worst one was 12 days, and we had one of 8 days just this last summer.
Now, how did those correlate to what the actual storage was at the time, like in July and August? So for instance, when you showed that previous chart, you can always tell what the correlation is as far as the actual New York City storage at that time. Whereas if it was low at that time, they would give you the excuse, they're saying, well, you're saving water. But in that other chart, they were above what the historical average was for total storage, let's say. And what would they say?
Right.
Say, well, you've got enough water,
Right.
It's hot, it's now July and August, why aren't you releasing? Because that's the frustration on a lot of the guides, that they're saying, they look at the numbers, they say, well, Cannonsville right now is at 93%. It's not at 75% or 68%, it's at 93%. What are they holding back the water for?
Yeah.
And why aren't they giving us more water? Until it's too late and it becomes reactive.
Right. So the story is this, Tony, is that since the FFMP went into effect, 2007, they have never been out of the normal range in the summer.
They've never been done.
Never.
Okay.
So they've always been, the normal range is what's called technically among those who follow this, the L2 range. Every summer from 2007 to date, they've always been in. That's one of our arguments, as you'll see, that water is available.
L2 or above.
Yeah, L2 or L1, exactly, yeah.
That 81.3 degrees Fahrenheit, that seems like a big challenge. But that doesn't occur in one day, I'm guessing. Does that occur over time, and were it mitigated earlier, you may not even get to the 81 degrees?
That's true. And this is what happened. All of this is what happened basically without a mitigation program. Now, that's not entirely true, because a few sporadic attempts were made. But it's very fair to say there was no mitigation. This is what happened, and what we have calculated is the total amount of water to knock these things down, including this one and others. And you may be actually right, Andy, that if you get it in advance, you wouldn't need that amount of water, because there's a dynamic that happens that as things heat up, the rocks heat up, and then what happens is pumping cold water down there to already heated up riverbed is wasted cold water, which is why when we were participating in the original design of the FFMP, we decided not to try to put such a thermal stress relief program in effect, because the fishing community had judged that it didn't work, that it was being misused at the time. So that's why I say we're saying really experimental program. It's not that we've got every I dotted and T crossed here, but I think we've got the basic ideas, and that if this were implemented in an experimental fashion, you would learn as you go more about the dynamics of the system. So that's the magnitude of the problem. Now, here's the ninth part I really like. This is the part that required a little bit of statistical mathematical theory. Here's what we want to do. We want to find an equation that's going to tell us how much water you have to release to knock those temperatures down. Well, that equation is going to have to recognize everything else that's happening. It has to recognize there's water coming from the Beaver Kill, there's water coming from Papacton, there's water coming from Cannonsville, that there's air temperature changes, that the water was hot yesterday already. So all those factors have to be taken into account. And some of the gauges that you want to use only operate sporadically or weren't operating at all. So it turned out to be a fairly serious technical challenge, and the most fun for me of the project. Here's what we have to do, say graphically, here's the challenge. Find an equation that reproduces that graph. Okay? And that one of the components is going to be water from Cannonsville or Papacton. Now, what we found out, as fishermen's instincts have told for many years, we really have quantified it now, that water from Cannonsville is more than twice as effective as water from Papacton in reducing temperatures on the main stem. So here's what I have to do is find an equation that will do that. And here are all the factors. I think I kind of said most of that here, and bearing that in mind, that math, okay? So here's what we found. We did find an equation, and it's in this computer printout. Details you don't have to worry all much about. We found that Cannonsville is much better in its impact on Lordville than Papacton. Excuse me. Okay, and here's the operative number. A 100 CFS Cannonsville release, or additional release, reduces the Lordville maximum daily temperature the next day, so there's a 1 day lag in the system, by 0.47 degrees centigrade, or 0.85 degrees Fahrenheit. Thus it takes, for most of us who think in the Fahrenheit system, it takes about 118 cubic feet per second, released for a day in advance, to get down to Lordville and cool it by 1 degree. And it came from the statistical analysis of these equations. And we've tested the hell out of this equation, so we have a lot of confidence in it. The equation, there's some complications that the more water you've already got in the river, the less impact this is going to have, and we've judged that. But as I'm going to show you, I'll show you some graphs that I think will persuade you that this is
And the
a really good
reason
equation.
for point one, just so that people that don't know, where it says Cannonsville water has a substantial higher impact, that's because Cannonsville is closer to Hancock than the Pacton is, I would assume, one.
That's one
Distance,
part, yeah.
And also that basically in July and August, the lower Beaver Kill and then the East Branch would be warm, because there's many times when we would get to Point Mountain and the differential between the West Branch and the East Branch might be 15 degrees.
Yeah, but I think we've explored this. I don't think the Beaver Kill plays that much. Beaver Kill is there.
Or let's just call it
And
the
then
lower
where it comes
East
in.
Branch, because
Yeah.
if you get to Point Mountain and you
Yeah.
put your toe in the water on the East Branch and then also on the West Branch, there might be a difference of 10 or 15 degrees.
Right, and it also has to do, I think, with the dynamics of the bottom, tree shading, and a whole bunch of things. But basically, you're right, in that distance matters
Right.
an awful lot, yeah.
Okay.
And so we look very carefully at all those distances of the Cooks Falls gauge, the Downsville gauge, Stoutsville gauge, et cetera, yeah. So all these results, you know, as Tony is seeing, as he's on the river a lot, they just reinforce your intuition. There's nothing here that said, wait a second, we got it wrong. So that coupled with basic physics says, and that's why this stuff works so well. By the way, for those of you who know a little statistics, we have got regression equations here with an extraordinary predictive ability. It just doesn't happen often in the world of statistics. It's happening here because the problem is physics. It's this water is warming up in a basically orderly way. So just to show you how good this equation is, here was my challenge. Find an equation that reproduces this graph. There it is. The red is our equation from the computer model, and you can see that it is basically reproducing that graph really well. So we've got something to have a lot of confidence in. But that was the problem. There's a solution. And then what we did is try to project. So we did things like take data from only 2007 to 2011, compute the equation, and then use the equation to project ahead into the next year, which is a more challenging test. And once again, the blue line is the actual temperatures at Lloydville. We saw that graph earlier this evening. And the red line is our predictions of it. So we're doing one hell of a job. I mean, I do statistics in other domains, and very rarely do you get results as good as this. So here's the bottom line. Putting all of this arithmetic together, doing the accounting, our estimates are really that, and these are the numbers that we really like to work with. To do a reasonable job of cooling, you need about 3,400 CFS days of water in an average summer to cool the water down just about a half a degree below that 75 degrees. In the worst summer, it would take about 6,500. So the question is that water there? Well, we knew back when we made this presentation to the Crete parties earlier that they already allocated 9,400 CFS days in a special bank of water called the IERQ, at least part of which should be available to do this job. So our feeling was we're on the road. But at that time, we didn't have some of the data that I'm going to show you now, which is going to testify to water availability. That's the question. Is there enough water? This is going to be New York City's resistance. And they are resisting. They are resisting. Where is the water coming from? And those fish is only about one point of the river. Why don't the fish just swim somewhere else? We're getting all those arguments, so we need your support. Yes, water is available. Why? The current program already has this water bank called the IERQ to meet special needs. So we asked them, how's the IERQ water being used? How long did it take before we got a response?
It was a month.
They didn't want us to know these numbers.
Yeah, they were embarrassed.
They were embarrassed. So finally released to us. I had to go up either to the Pope or someone. that there's more water unused on average in the bank than we're asking for the worst summer. Okay? So Jim and I are saying there's water available. Reservoir storage under the FFMP has been generally well inside the normal range. As I said earlier, Tony, it's been inside the L2 range since 2007. In fact, it's been 22 billion gallons above the historical median over that time. And in every single year, they've spilled water over the reservoirs. Now, to some extent, spilled water is wasted water. However, the city has to be prudent. Their basic strategy, which we agree with, is to fill the reservoirs on June 1st. And that would mean probably having some spilling as of June 1st. So all in all, this is saying, again, another piece of evidence that there's water. Third piece of evidence. They've got a very complicated computer system that they're using to manage the river now, which they're not revealing all the details of to us. And one of my students helped design it. And they publish, roughly monthly, they publish a document on the River Master's website called the OST FFMP General Release Summary. And it's an interesting document. It tells what they're scheduling to release over the next month. And we've checked on that. They basically are doing that. So they're basically following the rules. And they also calculate the amount of water that's available. So here's what they do is they forecast inflows to the reservoirs. They forecast their diversions up to the end of the water year, and they net those out, divide by the number of days. They say that's the water available. Well, if you look at these things as we have, that the water available has been 221 cubic feet per second per day, every single day, above what they're scheduled to release. So there's more water available than they're releasing. So piece of evidence 3. Number 4, a good part of the east of Hudson, New York City water system, Croton system, has been offline for a number of years. It's going to come online in 2013, and it will give to the city another 290 million gallons of really high-quality water to the city. Now, I think it's not our province to say how New York City will actually use that water. They've got a variety of problems to deal with, including turbidity problems in the Catskill system. But it's more water. It's not less water, it's more water. And that water has got to, if they're doing these calculations here properly, that water has got to add to the calculation of water availability. So our judgment is there's going to be still more water available on average in the coming years. And here's the picture. I said that they are in this L2 range. Once again, this is reservoir storage is the blue, is the actual reservoir storage. The green is the median, and the red is the drought watch curve. So this is basically the L2 territory. They're in there all the time. Every time you go above reservoir capacity, you're spilling. So that's the spilled and wasted water. And just the picture is saying to us the water is there. And we're not asking for enormous amounts of water in this program. I think it's entirely feasible. So one last little technical part of the thing is, can you forecast when these events will happen? And the answer is yes. So first of all, Mark Hartle has done one heck of a job of doing that in the last few summers. And we just thought we'd try to supplement that by doing a statistical approach, which we've done. And we're using a statistical method very similar to what's being used by PPL on the Lackawaxen River. Again, it's a kind of standard thing in this water management game. So we have an equation for forecasting the temperatures. And once again, I just want to show you it's a darn good equation. The blue curve are actual temperatures at Lordville, and the red are our forecasts. And so what we're doing now is we're using only data that would be available before the day in question. So we're using river temperatures on previous days. We're using the National Weather Service forecast for air temperatures ahead. And it comes out to be a pretty simple and remarkably effective equation. So now I'm going to close down by saying, where do we want to go? What do we want to do? First of all, there's a model. And we're suggesting to imitate that model. The PPL program in Lackawaxen is using basically the ideas we've been talking about this evening, and it's been very effective, been operating for 2 years. So that is something to be imitated, not in a cookie cutter mold, certainly, but to do some more research to see how to adapt those ideas. And the program is based on statistical forecasts, much as I've just shown you. It's been very effective. There are protocols available on the internet that you can see exactly how they're doing it. So if we wanted to really pick some of that information up and use it, it would happen directly. So what's next is we urge implementation of an experimental program based on these ideas. And we're seeking your support for this. And we believe it should be done in an experimental way. That no one knows exactly all the details of this dynamic system. It should be done in an experimental way, collecting data and being prepared to modify and adapt as we go along. And we're suggesting, as happened with the development of the FFMP and with the implementation of the ideas from the Joint Fisheries White Paper, a collaborative approach. That Jim and I did a lot of this research, and we have a couple of students at Columbia working with us. We and our partners in the Conservation Coalition would be happy to collaborate. And the obvious partners would be New York City technical experts on the reservoirs, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission fisheries people, and New York State fisheries people. Working together, we're sure we can do the job, and it can be done in time to be implemented in June 1st, when they have to revise the operating rules anyway. We have an interesting window, which we've taken advantage of twice before. The rules are expiring, you've got to do something new, or you got to go back to the old rules, which would be devastating. So we're suggesting basically this add-on. And there's the beautiful East Branch, and I'm done.
I got a question. Now, if New York City came up to you and they said to you after a presentation like this, Doctor, you're very persuasive. What do you need? How much do you need? Just just like that. Just they cut to the chase, and say in July and August, right now, how much additional release from Cannonsville would you need to implement that 75 degrees at the end of the day of Lordville? 500 CFS, 600? I mean, you tell me. As far as the release in July and August, what they're going to ask you? Sounds great to me.
Yeah.
We've got the water. How much more do you need?
Okay, I mean, that goes back, what am I doing? I'm going the wrong way here.
Just as far as
Oh,
CFS.
well, it
just
was,
as far as-
basically, it's the numbers I showed you. We estimate that on average, you need about 3,500 CFS days of water.
But what would that equate out to? I mean, as far as, we're getting what, Jim, 325 now in the summer?
500.
500 in the summer.
500 CFS every day.
Right.
Right.
And what we're asking for is, give us this bank of 3,500 to 6,000, somewhere in that range.
Right.
So let's just say 3,000 CFSs that they give us as a bank. And so we're not gonna use it every day.
Right.
We're gonna use it only when we need it. And so some days we may take 100 of that and bump the release up to 600.
Okay.
So if we do that for one day, now our bank goes from 3,000 down to 2,900.
Right, but you wouldn't basically have like the yo-yo releases that everybody's that you know about, everybody knows about on the river. That it would be gradual, because when you were talking about a pulse, you would go from say 500 up to 650 or 700, because your
Right.
deadline, your range is Lordville, not Long Eddy, not Hankins. It's Lordville's what you want to achieve, correct?
Yeah,
And so if we already have 500, a pulse for 24 hours, 48 hours, or 3 or 4 days of an extra, even 200,
Okay.
will go from 500 to 700.
All right.
You're not going to see the really nasty sort of yo-yos that happen because of Montague,
Right.
where you might see a release of 700 or 800 drop down to 200 or 300, based on the conditions. So it will go up and down, but it won't be drastic.
Right.
yeah, and I think Tony, that's the reason that we would prefer not to sort of dictate this evening. If we got the fisheries people together in the room and we worked this out, you'd say, well, if you pulse up by 200, no one's worried about that. Do you want to drop by 200, or do you want to drop by 100 and wait 12 hours later and drop by another 100? You'd have to work out the details and like the arithmetic on how much water you use for a variety of alternatives like that. Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand you correctly. The decree parties, which of course New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, New York City,
Right.
what's their downside? Why, what objection would Pennsylvania or New Jersey or any of the lower downstream users have to this proposition?
Yeah, well, there's one. Well, I mean, there are two objections, I think. From New York City's viewpoint, any gallon of water that's not in the reservoir is not in the reservoir. You know, and they're always thinking that the drought of the century, they used to say to us, the drought of the century could be starting tomorrow. So there's some credibility to that, except it's like you're buying insurance on insurance. So that's their take, and we have to persuade them that this is essentially minimal risk for maximal gain. It's a cost-benefit trade-off. On the other decree parties, a big concern is Trenton and the salt front, Trenton, and the other uses of the IERQ. This IERQ water, some of it is allocated to meet the needs of the Trenton flow target and keeping the salt front from coming far enough upriver to interfere with Trenton's water intake. So what we would need to do then is really be able to persuade them that this amount of water isn't going to interfere with meeting the Trenton targets.
At our last UDC meeting, someone mentioned that, this was a warm water fishery. Well, if our jurisdiction is from Hancock down to Deer Park, or, Deer Park, can you have, and say, well, it's a warm water fishery, well, I'd like a cold water fishery. Can you have both in the same river?
So, you know, it's interesting that last week, some of you may know him, Nat Gillespie, who was a fisheries biologist with Trout Unlimited and now works for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was invited by decree parties to go down to Trenton to talk to them about fish biology and release rules, and actually comment on our proposal. He made the point to them that this is a cold water fishery. It is. It wasn't before you built the dams, but it is a cold water fisheries now. There's no way you can escape that. The question is, are you going to manage this cold water fishery well or poorly?
But you're not talking about Barryville?
No, say cold water fishery, it's a cold water fishery certainly to Lordville, below Hancock. It's a cold water fishery to Calhoun up to, say, June 1st. And I've actually I looked at the data off the Calhoun gauge. I looked for the first day in each year when it gets to 68 degrees. It's basically the last week of May, the first week of June. So, and as we know, spectacular fishing down there. It's a great cold water fishery up until then. So he made the point to them, which I think I agree with, that you've got this fantastic cold water fish. It's not just a cold water fishery. It's one of the greatest in the world. It's just fantastic. People come here from Montana, from all over the world. So why not manage it to get the best out of it? And it is a unrealized economic resource for this part of our two states, particularly New York and Pennsylvania. So I think it's a big interest of you folks in the upper Delaware here to try to manage that. You do have a great warm water fishery from Calhoun on down, way down. It's a big and thriving fishery, and I think that nothing that we're doing here seriously interferes with that. Don Hamilton may have some views on that. I'm hoping we're not in conflict.
There's 53 different species of fish in the river, and our knowledge about some of their habitat needs is limited. Trout have been studied a lot more, and more is understood about their habitat needs. But I think it's always something we need to be cognizant of, is developing a better understanding of the needs of other indigenous anadromous fish like American shad, what their requirements are. This is an extremely important river to sea-run migratory fish like American shad, American eels, sea lamprey, and striped bass to a certain effect. And we need to work on developing a better understanding of their habitat needs along with trout. And understand where there are maybe conflicts and how those should be managed.
Yes.
In all of your calculations, what would happen now with the proposed project on the Cannonsville for the hydroelectric plant?
That's what I was gonna ask.
Man, I was kind of like, we were amazed, or at least at the last meeting, when we asked the DRBC rep. She basically told us what they were increasing, 4 turbines. I forgot exactly what the CFS is, but I've heard nothing about that in your calculations. And I don't even know what their time frame is, but obviously it's gonna be something you're gonna have to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, we were told, now, I don't know how much you can depend on this, we were told that the releases were not gonna change. That
Well,
they-
that's not what
that
Carol
they're-
Collier said. I mean, she was talking about significant increase. I mean, they're putting in a hydro, and it's gonna be for hydroelectric. And she said something about 4 turbines. So anyway, my understanding was they weren't gonna run, all of them at 150 to make 600, you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, except that the releases are really up to the decree parties. I mean, and in order to change the release schedule or the amount of water released, has to be by unanimous consent of the decree parties. That's what we've been fighting for all this time. So New York City can't change the release patterns because now they have turbines. They're going to, at least, again, what we've been told, and in theory, it's look at the FFMP table, release X amount of water, and then however many turbines can be run with that amount of water, that's how many will be run. It's not like we have 4 turbines, we're gonna run more water to do that. That's not gonna happen.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just
Yeah.
telling you what the
My
DRBC
thought is that
rep
we shoot
said.
yourselves in the foot. I mean, think that, as they've been saying for all of these years, these reservoirs exist for one purpose, and one purpose only, and that's drinking water for New York City.
Well,
And so if they're going to manage them, if they're going to manage them in conflict with that, I think then that something would happen that they would not wish, and that some fishermen would wish, and they'd be back in the Supreme Court.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah.
It was kind of news. I didn't know which side of the reservoir they were putting it in. One person had said the outflow system, and then others said they were going to do it into the West Branch, and that's what Carol Collier told us at the meeting. That's the proposal.
Just have a question. Has New York City water needs remained consistent?
They've actually gone down over the last 20 years, modestly. They're using less water.
I know some years ago they made
Yeah,
an effort.
I mean, they're
put in
still-
shower heads and all that.
They're still pretty far above the national average for urban water systems in their usage. It's something like 130 gallons per resident per day. And it's believed they could easily get down to 100 if they put their mind to it.
By comparison, Boston is about 60.
Do
60.
do you see a need to stress the economic benefits of what you're trying to propose here? I mean, to the average you guys are fishermen,
Yeah.
but the average person says, it's a fish. What does it mean to
Yeah.
us?
Well, I think so. Certainly from your viewpoint, and being the political folks in this part of these 2 states, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but Trout Unlimited did a study some years back that Jim and I used in a paper we wrote. I'm a kind of early Alzheimer's guy. I can hardly remember. I can't find my keys. So I don't remember the numbers, but it's a pretty substantial numbers, like $20 to $40 million in the fishing industry of people coming up here and running motels, using the guide service, buying equipment, meals in restaurants and all of that. And certainly, as I see, I've had the privilege of fishing a lot of places all over the world. This is kind of underexploited. And you go, say Deposit is an interesting town. You would think that with all the great fishing in and around Deposit, that it would be a much more welcoming, attractive center for people to come to, and frankly, it's not. And I think Hancock is not. You've got a potential of trying to build an economy here around fishing to exploit the fact that one of the things I've tried to do, that we're trying to do with the FFMP and with this, is turn the fishery from a 2-month fishery to more nearly like a 4-month fishery. So what everyone knows is the season starts April 15th or so. April, May, up to the beginning of June, it's great, great fishing. And then everyone thinks it's dead. Now, the FFMP has extended that somewhat, particularly in the West Branch and the upper part of the main stem. And the more that we can do to extend that, the more vibrant this economic life is going to be.
The other thing is that you're talking about a system that has wild trout, which is just, it's apples and oranges comparing a wild trout to a stocked fish. And I don't just explain to you, because Larry, that you had mentioned about, well, it's just fishing, but for many anglers, whether they're in the Northeast or in an urban area, to fish over wild trout, whether they're rainbows or browns, is very special. I mean, it's a better class of fish, a better fight, a beautiful fish. These are anglers that would go to Patagonia, they would go to Wyoming, they'd go to Craig, Montana, in search of wild fish, wild trout. And to have something so close to the city, 2 hours away, makes it very affordable, as opposed to flying to Denver or Salt Lake City. I mean, this is just a world-class fishery. It has the potential to be even better. As Peter had said, you can extend the season if we're given enough water. And that's the key, all right?
And I certainly, I agree with that. I just think that it's important that people outside of that sport fishing understand that there's a tremendous potential economic gain for this area by better managing the river.
I should
But
add
let me
that.
just share one other thing, because I think this is humorous. I mean, I have a fellow who works for me who was a very avid fly fisher, and he said he had great fishing this past summer. And he fishes a lot in the Coshecton area.
Yeah.
But he's like a lot of fishermen. He doesn't want the word to get out.
Wow.
So how do you talk?
I think
It's a story of my life, you know. I painfully put in my years on the up in the West Branch with my little canoe, paddling around, finding good spots, you know. And then it's now I don't want to fish on the West Branch anymore. I go in there, paddle down the river, 3 guys standing where you want to fish, and so it goes. So I'm not doing myself any good in publicizing improving the river.
But I think what Larry asked is, what about a guy who's not the fisherman? What does he care? And that's why I think it's so important that we recognize that there's no downside. So the guy who doesn't care about, he's not losing anything. None of the downstate users, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they're not losing anything. So it's a win situation for certain facets, but it's not a lose situation for the others. So why not? Why not improve something? And by the way, when you talk about the Upper Delaware Council, when you go to the River Management Plan and you look at the mission statement and it talks about this is what we're supposed to do, watch out for habitat, protect against rapid temperature fluctuations. That's from the River Management Plan, okay? So I think that is our charge as council members. And if I was goring someone's ox, you know, I would be, a little nervous about it, but no one's getting hurt here. That's.
Well, I think the other thing to keep in mind too is that Peter and I have said all along, and you mentioned it at the beginning, that if the fishermen are happy, that's great, but really it's about the fish. And we've always said and used the analogy that trout are like the canary in the coal mine. If we have healthy trout, we know we have a healthy river. So it's about making the river healthy too, not just for the trout.
Just first of all, thank you guys. I mean, this is volunteer work. It's very impressive. I mean, that statistical graph that was dead on is, I mean, I don't believe it. The p-values were probably 0.00001. That's pretty amazing. So just thank you guys for that. The one question I have is, I still don't understand, if you're going to ask that there be more water, then the issues of the Montague gauge and the Trenton salt line, that's gone. There's going to be more water to push it down, correct?
No, the issue here is really timing. So we're saying there's a block of water in the reservoir, and I've said this a couple of times in situations people understand. other people don't understand what's really going on. Every drop of water in the reservoir is going to get to the ocean somehow. The question is when. So what we're possibly going to do, I mean, it's possible that we interfere with Trenton as we take water that they would like to hold and release a little bit later to push the salt line down, and we might already have used it for our purposes. So it's not as if there's no conflict here. But the basic thing over and over again is timing of the releases. And what has made things work for us so far was that when Jim and I started in this game, they were wasting enormous amounts of water. More than 25% of the water coming into the reservoirs was spilling over the tops of the reservoirs. And that's when we knew we had leverage. He said, let's try to change the timing so instead of being spilled when it did no one real good, we'll try to release it at other times.
But then how did Pennsylvania, with their working with Wall and Paul Pack and PP&L, get the permission to just release when they want? Aren't they part of the Montague Gauge and the Trenton thing? And it seems to me that they've gotten that permission.
Well, they don't really have a direct responsibility.
Aren't they part of the Montague Gauge? And
Yeah, their water is.
yeah.
But they don't have the Supreme Court gave New York City responsibility to manage the reservoirs so that the flow at Montague is 1,700 cubic feet per second at all times. It's actually a stupid requirement because it doesn't take into account seasonal needs, but that's what New York City has to do. Now, what happens is that the city has to make up for water that might not be released from Montague. I know, from Lackawaxen. Or conversely, if water is released from Lackawaxen, New York City doesn't have to release that. That drives the fishermen bonkers because it means upriver, the river gets starved. So that whole dynamic is an important issue. I think Jim and I feel we're in a kind of minority in our conservation group. I think we feel that that's no longer a prime issue as it was in previous years. But it's still there, and it causes these whiplashes, yo-yoing, and in previous years was really, really serious. You may have noticed this year it wasn't a really big problem, partially because by having to smooth out their releases to meet their own thermal requirements on Lackawaxen, those releases are more even than they were in previous summers. But that's why I wanted to show you that diagram that had these big pots of water and all this stuff flowing around. It really is a pretty complicated system, and you've got to take into account all the dynamics that are going on there.
So one of the things that we've managed to do is we've taken something like 23 or 4% of the water that's spilled. And this is the hard concept for New York City to take, is if it's gonna spill in the spring, we'd like you to release that the previous summer before it spills. And so we've managed to say we've managed to convince them that they can do that. And it's now 23% of what used to spill is not spilling, and it's being released in the previous summer before it would have spilled. And that's a huge, huge step forward. And what we're asking for now for the thermal release, and I just tried to do a quick calculation, but if you have, what we're asking for is 4,000 or 5,000 CFS days. That's probably close to the equivalent of 1 day of water that comes into the Cannonsville Reservoir for a whole year. I mean, one day's water is about that amount of water that we're asking for to put in our bank to use through the whole summer. So it's not, it's not going to drain the reservoirs, and New York City shouldn't have too much of a problem with that. And it's already been allocated for special needs. And what we're saying is this is a special need.
So we do my sense of the politics is that input from Upper Delaware Council is really pretty important. And we're trying to build a momentum, a political momentum behind these ideas, and your input was one of many, but it was a significant input on this white paper initiative. And you know what they told us every time we do something, they tell us it can't be done. So the first time I made a presentation about FFMP ideas, the chief hydrologist for New York State says, he says, Professor, and you know you're in trouble. He says, Professor, you got some interesting ideas there, but your thinking is a little bit out of the box, and our job is to stay in the box. Okay? Then when Jim and I first said, the year following that the key is to explicitly recognize how much water New York City diverts, as opposed to theoretically what they could divert, they said, we're not even willing to discuss the idea. Now it's being implemented. Then when the white paper came along, they said this was just theoretical concepts, and then slowly, all of a sudden we see that they're not exactly there, but they're getting there. So I'm somewhat optimistic. I don't think this is a hopeless cause. Yes?
Yeah, in the past we talked about yo-yo releases and so-called reactive releases, and kind of, it sounds like you have the equation you're using is going to work. It sounds like a lot of this is going to be based on timing, and I guess the question is, once you get everybody to sit down and agree with this, is New York City going to play ball and say, well, you're going to need to do the release at such and such a point, not 48 hours later when it's going to be kind of a reactive release,
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing twice as much caloric heat loss than
Right.
would have been required at the proper time. Are you going to be able to get them to kind of say, okay, we'll set it up in some sort of feedback loop as soon as these parameters are met,
Right.
we'll release.
We're in a kind of a bind in a way, and this is a political thing that opinions change. The key player here is man Paul Rush, who manages the reservoirs. And he said, not to us directly, but through through his people, that he didn't want, we call it an algorithm, a technical, like equation that says exactly what to do. He doesn't want that. He wants guidelines. Well, we could develop an algorithm. I mean, the makings of it are there, right? You just put two and two together and you have an algorithm. But I'm kind of playing along with them, say, okay, Paul, you don't want an algorithm. Here are some guidelines. Get your team together and let's work out how to do this collaboratively. So that's part of our political thrust, to be collaborative and defer to their sense of risk, which is somewhat justified. The drought of the 1960s could come back and bite us again. And that's the spirit of the proposal. We hope that they would collaborate, as they have in the past. Sometimes without even saying they're doing it. They'll tell you what they're doing, and then a proposal comes out, and you say, gosh, that's what we were talking about a month ago.
I'd like to just make a point with respect to where we are in the process. Peter's been working and Jim has been working on this for some time, and the proposition was discussed at Water 3 in the fall. And since that time, groups have heard about it, it's been explained to them, and I had a conversation recently with Dan Plummer, who was one of the organizers of Water Everywhere. And he's communicated back to me that this proposition has, at this point, received the support of river users and stakeholders, including the Delaware River Conservation Coalition, including Friends of the Upper Delaware River, Trout Unlimited National, New Jersey Trout Unlimited, New York State Trout Unlimited, Pennsylvania Trout Unlimited, the Dave Brain Chapter of Trout Unlimited, the Federation of Fly Fishers, Theodore Gordon Fly Fishers, and the Wild Trout Fly Fishers. So there's a broad base of people that are users and people who have really tried to protect the river, enhance the river. All these conservation organizations have all joined, and if the Upper Delaware Council adds its voice, because this decision is going to be within the next several months.
We hope. I mean, I'm thinking that March 7th, which is the next DRBC meeting, will be important. We're trying to get an audience with Paul Rush prior to that. But they have to make some decision by June, I know, their rules say they have to make a decision by June 1st. But what happened in the past is that if they can't get a unanimous vote, then they kind of extend things and a decision might not be made until September. It's hard to tell what the dynamic will be. But on paper, June 1st is the deadline.
You just heard Andy talk about all the folks that support this. What, other than like Trenton and some of the other that you mentioned, I only heard like two. How many folks have you heard from that don't support this, that are opposed to this?
You don't really hear. See, I mean, a crazy dynamic goes on. Is you go into his room down at the URBC, you make this pitch like I made to you, but with a lot more details. And no one says a word. They just sit there. And then you hear later, you hear kind of murmuring, well, someone in the down basin states has some concerns. So that's the last thing we heard, was that some down basin people had some concerns. We heard that through New York City, but they didn't tell us who or exactly what. So we know enough about the dynamic to realize that Trenton is one issue. What other concerns are, we don't know. Part of it is, I think, a sense of proprietariness. That is, they believe that the IERQ, it's interim excess release quantity. This comes from a Supreme Court decree, and they think that's their water. And the idea behind it was that in the original calculations of the Supreme Court decree, they figured out how much water New York City would take. They figured out about how much water you needed to meet the Montague flow target, and that didn't use up all the water. So they thought then that what would happen is the water would be hoarded behind the reservoirs, and it would spill even worse than it had been spilled. So this IERQ was a way to force them to release more water. And the down basin people say that's their water. So they're not, I think, happy with the idea that we fishing guys have a use for that water. And I think that we just need to have some more conversation with them to show them that we're not doing them harm, or in fact, maybe the rules have to be written so that Trenton is dominant. I mean, it wouldn't be our preference, but a rule like that could be written.
But to Al's point, our jurisdiction, though, and our concern and our mission has to do with what's on the wall. It's not, our mission is not to protect Trenton. Our mission is to protect that.
That basically was what I was asking, like, more locally, up here in the upper Delaware. You have not heard much opposition?
No, I honestly don't see anyone that does any harm to. And the quantities of water we're talking about are modest. That is, what typically would be happening. Well, first of all, this wouldn't happen if you're not in L2. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's a rule they didn't even talk about. If you're in L2, that means that the release from Kansville is going to be 500. So what we're talking about is going from, say, 500 to 700. You won't even see it. You'd have to be like Tony, who really knows the river, to notice what that difference is. So the boaters, the canoers, and others, it would be to their benefit, but they probably wouldn't even notice.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Anybody else? Any
I
other
didn't even
questions?
show you my fishing pictures from Patagonia.
Thank you very, very much.
Peter, along with some of this other discussion, I'd just like to point out that there's a whole economic aspect to the value of ecosystem services in this system. It's a relatively intact functioning ecosystem. It's the last on-dammed major river on the Atlantic coast. And it has the full complement of a lot of native species, which very much more efficiently process nutrients. And that's an area that hasn't been studied as well as it could be, although we increasingly have means of doing that. And we are looking at things now in terms of how this intact functioning ecosystem can process more efficiently nutrients, incorporate them into sea-run migratory fish that swim back out of the ocean with them, so they're not flushed down into the lower Delaware like they are in Chesapeake Bay. And you can actually assign economic value to that, because we know how much it costs to remove excess nutrients from some of these systems. So that's something that's being looked at, and along with the recreational valuations we're doing, that really is a component that can be expanded upon and show a lot more value for what's occurring in this system. And
I would just like to thank Peter and Jim for the work. How lucky are we, as we're trying, our job is to manage this river and to make sure it's as healthy as possible, to have two people who've dedicated years of their lives to try to figure this out and to improve it. So I just want to thank you for that.
I've been at it years before I came on the scene, but I naively thought when I volunteered to do some of this work, there'd be a couple of hours of work.
Couple of years.
Wow, yeah, my hair was darker. Okay, well, thank you.
Great, thank you. So do you want to take a 3-minute break? I mean, do you need
Oh,
your
well,
AV stuff, and then we'll start our meeting?
Oh, you have your,
Yeah.
okay.
But also, with this PowerPoint presentation, there's a lot of, let's get that out available
I emailed
for
that
our.
I got that from Peter
Yeah.
late this afternoon, so I
Yeah.
forwarded that to the whole board,
Okay.
and so you can.
Maybe we'll have some paper copies
As
here.
a
of the
PDF file,
original.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm gonna take off later.